Next up, we'll have a very interesting talk from a kind of maybe slightly unexpected direction. Because this year, I've been developing the program every year to include a little bit different kind of themes and also different kind of speakers, different kind of organizations, trying not to have the same people here on stage every year. And I think this year we're extremely lucky to have one organization that's not so frequently represented on the Finnish ground. I'll do a little bit of market research here and ask how many of you kind of know what kind of organization Frog is?
Wow.
But like 1/3. For comparison, we have an afternoon talk coming from IDN Research. How many of you know about IDN? There's some market data for you, Andreas. So here with me today on the stage, we have Andreas Markdalen. He's executive creative director for Frog at Europe, Middle East, Asia, something like that.
India, yeah.
You're based in Italy, right?
Yes, correct.
And very luckily for us, Andreas is here today talking about the beautiful Anomalies in creative work, which I will launch here on the display anytime soon. I will hand over Andreas the
Perfect.
check,
Thank
and
you
then
so much.
give him a big hand, Andreas Markdalen.
Thank you, Lassie. Thank you. And good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I remember an interview that I read with a world-famous designer called Philip Stark. You might know of him a few years ago, and a story that he was telling about pasta. And he told a sort of long process story and an anecdote around pasta, how much he loves it, and the fact that wherever he goes around the world, he would order a dish of pasta. But in the interview, he was also lamenting the fact that depending on where you would go in the world, you would have a very different quality when ordering this type of dish. So when he was commissioned to create his own pasta and craft his own type of pasta, he brought this kind of disappointment and unhappiness into the design process in creating the mandala from 1987. And what he wanted to do was actually try to solve. He had been speaking about American and French chefs in particular that tended to overcook the pasta. And he was trying to find a way for compensating or solving this problem in the process of creating this artifact. So what he did was to create a pasta shape that was cylindrical in form, that would always have 90% of air embedded into the pasta shape itself. And he created this S-shaped spring right in the middle that would always maintain its shape, even when it was overcooked. More importantly, he created these two wings that you can see on each side, and they were thicker on one side than on the other. And the reason for doing this, or his rationale for doing this, was making sure that even when there was a lousy chef in the kitchen cooking and overcooking the pasta, at least one half of it would always be al dente. And I thought that was a very beautiful story. Some 10 years earlier, another kind of legend and superhero, at least for me personally, speaking about typography design, Matthew Carter was commissioned by AT&T in the US to upgrade and update the Bell Centennial typeface, actually taking the Bell Gothic typeface and creating a new version of it called Bell Centennial. And the reason why AT&T was looking for this update was that they're essentially every year printing this phone book, which the older people in the audience might remember. There were these big catalogs or directories, physical books that contained the names and numbers of businesses or people in a specific area or region. And as they, AT&T, were transitioning in printing technologies from an old handset type technique to a modern technique based on linotype compositor, they realized that they had a problem with the typeface. It was the ink, as they were printing in these small sizes, was smudging, and the legibility was very poor. So Matthew Carter was brought in to solve this problem, and he did with this Bell Centennial typeface by inventing what you can see represented up there in the corner, the ink trap, which was essentially this little notch inside of the letter form that would allow for ink to bleed out and complete the shape as it was printed onto paper. And what I really loved about this project was the fact that when you looked at the letter shapes before they were printed, just looking at the form of them, it almost seemed like they were deformed. They had a kind of ugly quality to them that didn't feel like a beautiful piece of design. But the work in some way or form was completed as it was printed onto paper. And I fell in love with that idea too. More recently, and some of you might know this project from 2013, Neri Oxman and her team at MIT created a beautiful art piece or a speculative design piece where the ambition was something quite different from the previous two examples that I bring in. The team here was interested in exploring the intersection between biology, computational design, and robotics, and they wanted to see whether it was possible to craft an architectural structure combining machine-oriented processes and an organic life form, which in this case was the silkworm. And they created this silk pavilion within this project and basically studied the silkworm and the way it would weave silk in order to create a cocoon for itself in its natural habitat. And they used the inputs and the learnings of this study to program a robotic arm that would create the structure that you can see holding this architectural dome. And then throughout the project, they deployed 6,500 silkworms, I believe, to complete the shape. So using the silkworms to work from this established structure that had been created by the machine and deploying these live silkworms to kind of connect the dots and build out the remaining parts of the structure. And I love this project as a standalone art piece. I thought it was beautiful, but I also loved the way that Neri Oxman was describing it. She was talking about a designer's obsession with always creating systems based on efficiencies and industrializing processes. And what she wanted to do with this project and her team was to essentially create a system that was inspired by nature and was organic and left some areas and some open spaces for chance and imperfection. On a similar topic, and also speaking about being inspired by nature, and the final example for me here to kind of set the stage for my talk, I also wanted to show this raku tea bowl from 17th century Japan. And this artifact was created by a local craftsman called Honami, that I don't know a lot about, other than the fact that he came from a long family history of craftspeople and craftsmen, and that they were primarily working with swords, working for the dynasty in those days. As Honami grew as a craftsman and as he grew older, he became more and more involved in the tea ceremonies in Japan, which was a very significant kind of ceremony and event in Japanese traditional culture, and in also giving shape to these artifacts that would be part of it. And the Japanese tea ceremonies and this type of craft was inspired almost by a movement, even if they would never refer to it as a movement officially, that we refer to today as Wabi-sabi. And Wabi-sabi is something that is quite familiar to many of designers. It's a concept and a design philosophy that has been applied to many different things. And it's essentially a way for designers to, again, look to nature for inspiration, look at the fragility of nature and the ephemeral qualities of natural objects and use those as inspiration for the design. The people and the school of thought that followed Wabi-sabi always believed that the beauty in life would come from and always return back to nothingness. And you can see how the artifacts that Honami and many others from this period crafted really reflected this idea of celebrating imperfection and incompletion in their work. And why am I speaking about all of this? Why are these 4 different examples relevant for us in this room today, speaking about data-driven design? And that's a good question, if you have it. Well, I think all of these 4 examples are relevant to a specific theme that I'm very passionate about as a designer and that I like to explore as a concept. And it's the idea of how we can look for anomalies, flaws, errors, or imperfection in our design work to look for creative solutions and concepts. Mandala is looking for a way to almost anticipate human flaw or human error. The second example is about anticipating production error. The Silk Pavilion uses organic processes to create new types of beauty in a system. And the Wabi-sabi example, again, looks for artifacts that are created with inspiration from nature that drives on imperfection. And why is that interesting today? Well, as a designer, as a craftsperson myself, having a background in graphic design, I'm very much part of, like I'm sure many of you are as well, the kind of ongoing dialogue and discourse around where design is going, where expression is going, and where our experiences, where our products, how they're starting to take shape. And there is this ongoing discourse around the kind of conformity that is starting to take shape in the world today. And we're speaking about monocultures that are not only aesthetic, but also speak about the kind of biases that a non-diverse crowd would bring into product expression. And we're looking at a landscape of products today that are all starting to converge in a specific direction. And when I think of this, and the reason why I think it's relevant when speaking about imperfections and flaws, is that a lot of these things come from the fact that we've gotten pretty good at what we do as product designers. In many of the things that we shape, many of the artifacts and systems that we shape in our daily work, we're striving for perfection, and we're getting pretty good at delivering upon that. What happens is that there's a specific type of idea that tends to win, and that's a little bit what I want to speak about in this keynote today. I'm interested in this because it's related to my everyday work as an executive creative director at Frog. We work globally with design and strategic challenges across multiple different types of industries and many different disciplines. We do everything from architecture to industrial design, digital products, service design and strategy, etc. And of course, the general perception of understanding where design is going is important for us, not only to know how we can better position our work in the future, but also for us as a firm, as a consultancy, to understand how we can stand out and really generate design work that has meaning and value to people, and that makes a difference and that drives engagement. I'm also working globally with our global disciplines around just creativity. So speaking about things like craft, how we make things, how we can adapt processes and methodologies and tools to be future-proof. And maybe that comes back to the question that Lassie asked posed in the beginning of the day. Or is AI and is machine intelligence starting to eat into our design process, and how will that affect us on a daily basis? And all of these things are topics that we are discussing. But for me personally, this kind of friction, this kind of battle between perfection and imperfection actually goes all the way back to when I got started with design. And I came into design from the back door, being self-taught essentially, and making websites in the mid-90s and the late 90s. And one of my family members introduced me to this idea of being able to publish a website on the internet, which today seems fairly basic, but for me was life-changing. And as I discovered this new medium, this platform for self-expression and storytelling, which was obviously very early concepts that I didn't even understand in those days, I also came across design, almost as an outcome of that, being able to understand that there is this platform where you can express yourself, and there are all these tools like typography and color and shape and form that you can use to your advantage in order to make an impact. As I grew and as I got older and as I started learning more and more about design, I got more exposed to kind of traditional graphic design, but still coming into it from probably the worst entry point you could possibly imagine. I don't know if we have any graphic designers in the house here today, but some of you will then probably know David Carson. And David Carson was my first hero as a practitioner, as a designer in general. And his idea was speaking about design as a kind of a forum and a platform for self-expression, and really using human intuition as a way to reach people, as a way to tell engaging stories and create artifacts that would have an impact on people. And he was speaking a lot about imperfection. He was speaking a lot about flaws and errors and ugliness and using these almost like tools in the design process. I remember him using a lot of faxes, basically the old fax machines, faxing things to himself in order to get a very rough copy of whatever design he was working on so he could scan that in and build on top of it. So looking for these kind of errors in his process by himself. And that was my entry point. And it became kind of a starting point for me for how I was thinking about design. And I know that back in those days, in the early 2000s, the web design community, I wasn't the only one being inspired by Emigre and David Carson and the likes of these kind of anti-heroes that were rebels of graphic design. In fact, there was a large community of web designers back in those days that really were trying to combine these really rough offbeat aesthetics, the things that would be very different and stand out, that were playing with glitch and grunge and whatever else. But they were trying to bridge that with this front-end development in these HTML templates that usually came from software like FrontPage or Dreamweaver. And they tried to bring these two worlds together. And I remember how strange it felt to work with this very restricting medium and try to tell these very bold stories. And you can see that time and time again in the work that came out of web design in those days. Over time, of course, I got more exposed, and as I grew as a designer, I started learning more about the masters and more of the classic graphic design, understanding that there were designers out there like Vignelli or Miller Brockman or Gerstner that were speaking about design and graphic design, which was relevant for me as a craftsperson in a completely different way. They weren't speaking about the design of a singular artifact where a designer could apply their own intuition. Instead, they were speaking about systemic solutions to graphic design, typographic systems, color systems, grid systems that would ensure a level of quality that would solve problems beyond the singular. And with that also came a strong sense of aesthetics, being able to understand systemic beauty. And as I kind of got into all of this and as I learned more and more, I got more and more confused. And I felt more and more lost because I realized also in kind of learning more about interaction design and learning more about the fact that, hey, there were these things that were just communicating and speaking to people. There were also these other things that you actually have to interact with, and they were products, e-commerce, websites. And I realized that there were almost two types of design. There was a type of design that wanted to be good, that wanted to make a difference in the world and wanted to be user-friendly and human-centered. And I realized that on the other side of the spectrum, there was another type of design that wanted to be something else, that wanted to be radical and provocative and push the user or the reader or whatever to feel something different. And I loved both of these, and I didn't quite know how to navigate that. And in fact, we see that still today. When we're speaking about design at Frog and being one of the discipline leads for visual design and interaction design within our organization, we speak about this all the time. The kind of spectrum between designing for function and utility versus the idea of designing for emotion and imagination and poetry. And on the right-hand side, the conversations tend to get very subjective and artistic, and the clients tend to get a little bit confused and sometimes freak out when you even mention it, because on the left-hand side, we can always prove with data or something else that we're moving towards the right direction. On the right-hand side, it gets far more complicated. But this battle and this kind of friction, this friction between these two polar opposites is really kind of has defined my design career and is still defining a lot of the work that we do within Frog today. The need to perfect things versus the need to break things apart. I'm double clicking, that's not a good thing. All of this comes together in the interface, and we've been speaking a little bit about digital products and systems here today. I'm going to go a little bit geeky here and go all in on systems design and interface design, given that the kind of overall umbrella for my talk is craft. The interface is interesting because it is generally the meeting point and the platform for everything. It's the platform of interaction between a user and a customer and a brand or a product or an experience. And it's also the interface and the kind of platform for this clash between emotion and function. We are designing interfaces and experiences today that are both communicating and interacting with the user. And that creates, again, these kind of discussions that are really helping us to think about design in different ways. What we've noticed designing experiences for brands like Porsche is that obviously in this case, and using Porsche as an example, we've designed their full range of connected car features. So looking at ways of being able to have their customer base, Porsche owners, being able to control their car from remotely. And there is, of course, a specific level of utility and human-centered value attached to this, even if it's a very niche market. But what's also interesting for us in these design challenges is to understand what are the aspirational qualities of this brand. How do you design for premium? How do you design for exclusivity? And as we go into these types of challenges, we have there are two different parts to our design challenges. The first one is about defining concepts and expression that embody both of these sides, that take a little bit in from the functional side and take something in from the emotional side. And that's, if you look at the work Frog was doing maybe 10 or 15 years ago, that was the majority of the work, being able to define it. Being able to create that vision and say, hey, brand X, here's where you're going to go over the coming 5 years. Here's how it should look like, here's how it should feel like, and here's how it behaves. And then we would hand that design over to the client and they would take it from there. Increasingly, that's not the more common scenario, but instead now we are being asked to create systems and solutions that are built for maintenance, that are thinking about the same properties and the same philosophies that we are building around these design solutions, but are oriented and built for a completely different audience. And the way that we often do this is, of course, by creating systems and tying the loop back to some of the intro. Thinking of systems that are able, in some ways, for all of our clients to industrialize their design process, to find efficiencies between teams, to build a kind of common design vocabulary and a general idea to a design philosophy that a large group of people within an organization can understand. But not only that, also creating kind of tangible artifacts, components and screens and designs that can be used across an organization, not only for a specific product, but looking at multiple products and multiple channels in order to be able to scale these concepts to a larger ecosystem. And what we're challenged with in these moments is to create essentially systems that can be translated from this definition phase into this maintenance phase. And there is a kind of characteristic to some of the ideas that are starting to take shape in this context. We're looking at design, as I mentioned before, that is repeatable, scalable, coherent, and easy to learn. And someone mentioned the fact that we're bringing in customers into the design process, and that's definitely something that we see. We're also bringing in, we're creating hybrid teams between consultants, between clients and customers, and all of them, in theory, should be able to use these types of new systems that we're creating to maintain. And that means, as we're starting then to transition from concepts that sit at a very high level to systemic ideas that can trickle out and be used by a larger group of people, that there is a specific type of idea that wins. And that's often the idea that is pushing the design solution to move a little bit more in the generic direction. And that's a little bit why we've ended up in this space that we are today, where things are starting to converge and look very similar. So what is the nature of these new systems that we are creating? And for those of you who might have seen previous presentation from me, they know that I speak a lot about Airbnb because I think they do a lot of interesting R&D work. Essentially what Airbnb is doing right now is that they're forming a design system that is starting to become almost like a kind of design clay to design with. Where the design system and the tools that they're using are providing the input. And that takes us to a position where we're very far away from this long gone idea of David Carson's idea of starting from a blank sheet and a singular concept and working from intuition. What Airbnb is installing and looking at is a systems-based design process. And in this specific example that you can see on the right-hand side, they're using essentially computer vision in order to be able to scan a hand-drawn sketch and turn that into a full fidelity prototype in real time. And that is only possible because they're using their system as an input and as a kind of clay in this process. And this is a new kind of interesting paradigm that is starting to take shape. The systems are becoming more and more dominant for the reasons that I mentioned. They have to have a larger impact within an organization. And the design systems are also starting to become and blend with the design tools that we see around us. In addition to that, we're also starting to look at new ways of just describing and looking at design artifacts and form. If you study the work that is being conducted right now and some of the R&D things that are happening within Autodesk, and these are actually old examples, there are all of these new kind of generative processes that allows for designers to explore different form factors based on variables that are put into these design tools or put into these systems. And it's easy to imagine for me as a designer, having been now working with design for almost 20 years, how some of these artifacts and how some of these form factors will start to move into the artifacts in multiple variations into the future. So one of the things that I predict and many other people predict is that an artifact of the future could have multiple states built into it. And that we're looking for kind of self-sufficiencies and auto-generated features as part of our systems work, where maybe three contrasting approaches to a navigation framework or component design can be maintained within the same asset or the same artifact in a system. And that the system can test these three different variations with users, maybe without human interaction, run real-time analysis on the performance of these three different variations, and then redeploy the most efficient one. And this gets a little bit more speculative, but it shows a way of thinking about how the systems and the artifacts that we're starting to work with are changing in nature. And this could be one major trend looking at forward into the future. As a kind of natural next step to that, we've all seen, and I think someone referred to it before, this idea of being able to use style transfers and neural networks to use different input images to generate different output images. And you can see here on the left-hand side how this is applied to artistic artifacts. But in a recent experiment that you can see on the right-hand side by UiBot, we're looking at how a similar type of change could be applied also to aesthetic elements and structural elements of a UI system. And when you're starting to think about this idea of a dynamic artifact that can change in real time, maybe even test itself against multiple variations, and then you also have this idea of style transfers that could be applied on a system level, what really happens then is that we will have systems that are intelligent, that are continuously fed in by data, that are potentially self-optimizing, only using the pieces of the system that are performing the best, and that we're also starting to being able to deploy these changes to brand expression and some of these more emotional qualities to the design in real time very quickly. And this could have a massive impact for how we think about systems. We're also starting to see a much tighter connection between the design tool and the design system itself. And my prediction, and even if predictions are useless, my prediction is that this will blend completely in a few years, where the design system and design tool are feeding into each other continuously. And we start to see design tools that are bringing in both. And again, that comes back to using the design system as a tool. So, if we agree to the fact, and just for the sake of it, agree to this idea that everything is moving with these new intelligent systems that we're having, and with this conformity in design expression that we see around the world, this gentrification of design, we're moving towards automation. The question is, then what happens after that? And here's where I want to come back to some of the examples that I brought back in the beginning, and maybe think about how these very mundane, simple design stories from the past maybe could just show us a clue of ideas or concepts that we could be adapting in the future, trying to break this idea of perfection and trying to inject something irregular into our systems. And I'm going to start with mandala, the pasta shape. And there the idea, of course, was for Philip Stark to be able to anticipate the human flaw. The chef that was overcooking the pasta and coming up with design details that would actually compensate for this. And we're looking at design that is actually helping to compensate for human flaw and error. And this, I think, will be absolutely critical to the future of our design systems. We were talking about, and the reference came back to Kasparov earlier, and this idea of computers and the humans working alongside each other, whether they're playing chess or designing. Here, in the future of these systems and intelligent tools, designing with data, I think that this continuous feedback and support from the systems to the designer will be a very common principle. And my reference is also going to chess, which is a game that I've been playing throughout all of my life. And I remember as a teenager working with these chess puzzle books that essentially allows players of different levels to get prompts and challenges where you open up a book and you start in the middle of a game and you have a few correct next moves to play. And I will speak about why I think that's relevant to design in a second. And then on the right-hand side, we have the chess engine, which is now a kind of common de facto standard in most of the chess applications. And when you watch the World Championship chess games, etc., that can provide real-time analysis on the moves that the players are making. I think these two topics are interesting, and this idea of support and this idea of continuous learning within the new tools and the new systems that we're seeing is very significant. And we're starting to see how skill augmentation is starting to become a thing. So in this example from AutoDraw, we're looking at a rudimentary drawing that is done by a designer that is in real time being translated into a perfected pictogram. It's almost a little bit like the spelling check in Word, right, that I think we're all familiar with. And in my mind, I'm thinking of a future scenario in our design tools where we have similar types of features where the design tool can do a kind of design check as we're going through the different steps of our process and also make micro tweaks to our designs as we're moving forward. It's also been interesting to follow the kind of emergence of these design challenges that are very much sitting on a craft level or are happening as kind of viral campaigns right now. On the left-hand side, the daily UI design challenge where for 100 days a designer creates a UI component just for the sake of learning how to craft it within the tool. And on the right-hand side, a viral campaign that essentially was optimized to get designers to think about pixel perfection and being able to see design in new ways. And in my mind, where that goes when I think about this concept of continuous learning within our design tools, I think these kind of prompts and these kind of challenges will be brought into our frameworks and brought into our tools. And I think that, as we're starting to look at more distributed global networks of designers that are working all over the world, more and more of them are remote, this type of mentorship or this type of learning will be more and more common, built into our software. So if you compare the analogy between the chess engine and the chessboard and Figma, one of the more popular design apps that has just recently opened up their plugin platform for open source innovation, like what are the kind of features we can anticipate coming in the coming years? Well, maybe we will see plugins or features that give real-time feedback on the design moves that we're making as we're going through the design process. It might offer us challenges and prompts and give us different paths and simulate different directions based on the decisions that we're making. And also potentially providing auto-correction to our design decisions that we're making. And of course, this is very speculative and quite random, but this is kind of how it's shaped in my head. And how does anomalies and errors fit into all of this? Well, I think that much like with chess, if I'm going to continue with that metaphor, you have different types of gameplays, right? You have the attacking gameplay, you have the passive gameplay, you have the strategist, you have the exchanger. It's very similar in design to think about different ways of designing. Some people design an appropriate solution. Other people are going for a more rebellious approach. And maybe these kind of profiles are going to be built into our platforms as well, so that I can adapt the style of a designer that I love, or simply adapt a different type of the style of design that can push me in a specific direction. Again, highly speculative, but some of it could be relevant. The second example that I spoke to was the Bell Centennial typeface, and this idea of being able to create a form that anticipates a production flaw or a production error. And what I really loved about Matthew Carter's work was obviously the deep understanding and thinking about this specific problem, understanding how this typeface would render when it was printed on a piece of paper, the trial and error that was involved in the anticipation. But what was also interesting for me was this unexpected shape and form that came out of it, that felt like something that was completely, almost an escape from the rational approach to type design. It looked almost as something abnormal, something deformed, or something ugly or grotesque. And of course, we're talking about the context of type design, but I thought that was very interesting. So how can we, with these new automated design systems and with these new smart tools, design in a way that create things that helps us uncover the unexpected in the same way as the form that Matthew Carter did in those days? And I think one of the key steps for that, and I've referred to this example previously as well, is just being able to understand and map creativity and map output. Understand what are the different relationships between different types of creations that we're making. And this work was done out of the UK. It's called The Manifold of Fonts. It was essentially a way to look at, again, typographic shapes, map them in relationship to each other, and kind of list what areas on this space were unlikely versus likely solution spaces. And when you stretch that one step further and you think about Matthew Carter's work, you might start to think that there might be these unlikely opportunity areas when it comes to form and design that human designers today are too lazy to explore, or too ignorant to explore, or simply just not ready to explore. And maybe these types of machine-assisted technologies can push us into those spaces. Of course, these frameworks will be completely useless with having the right metrics to design from and having the right KPIs. And that's been the topic of some of the other conversations here today, or presentations. And that takes me to the third example, the Silk Pavilion by Neri Oxman. And here we spoke about design that is enabling for magic to happen. So within this design project, they were creating a machine-oriented structure where they would deploy these silkworms and allow for chance and imperfection to take place. And of course, I started thinking about what are the kind of frameworks and what are the kind of structures we could start thinking about as designers to unleash magic in our processes. And this is the way it looks like for them. They created these different studies upon how the silkworms were moving, how silkworms were reacting to heat, humidity, light, etc. And when you brought that in and you started thinking about our context, or as for systems designer, you start to think about what are the kind of variables that we are working with? What is the material that would actually influence an artifact in a modern design tool? And that took me to think of actually Anti's work. I think he's somewhere here. He's speaking later. His beautiful presentation from 2016 at Interaction 16, where he spoke about a similar kind of framework of optimization methods for kind of quantifying distinguished qualities to a design based on variables. And being able to create a framework that would enable you also to conduct tests and generate design and be able to ask yourself the kinds of questions that every designer wants to know, right? What is the best possible design in this context? How far are we away from the optimum? And what is the single best design change I can make to improve it? This is like radical speculative thinking here, because who doesn't want to know these things? But my mind went somewhere a little bit different as well from what Antti was speaking about in the last part of his presentation. I'll get to that in a second. But I started thinking about just the kind of metrics that we were using as designers today, everything from business and organization to accessibility, interaction patterns, brand metrics, and visual design or design principles in general. Obviously, with the customer or the user at the core of all of this, in the very center of everything. And I started thinking about like, what could a framework look like if you actually brought this into your design tools and you were actually able to quantify the impact of your design decisions based on these kind of variables. And some of them are easier to imagine than others. It's probably easier to imagine accessibility and design, harder to think about organization. But these types of frameworks, I believe in the coming few years, thanks to Antti and maybe other people, will start to take shape. And these frameworks will start to take shape. And I believe that we will start to see plugins that will go directly into Figma that will enable us to bring them into our design process as well. Finally, I want to speak to the T-bowl and Wabi-sabi as a design philosophy. And I wasn't quite sure where to go with this. There are a lot of designers speaking about Wabi-sabi. And I didn't really, as I was trying to complete this presentation, I didn't really know what takeaway I wanted to make from it. But I love the general idea of celebrating the beauty of things that are imperfect, impermanent, and incomplete. I think there's something about the nature of digital and digital artifacts, digital design, that speaks very much to this. And the fact that we're trying to use these old ideas of systemic industrialization maybe sits in conflict with this idea of following nature. And there was something to that drew my attention. I'm obviously not the first one to speak about this. There are many frameworks out there. There are aesthetic discourses. There are articles written about how Wabi-sabi can be brought into the UX process, etc. But none of them really resonated with me either, even if I liked them. Because there was something about Wabi-sabi that shouldn't be deriving or be driving a framework. There was something about Wabi-sabi that was completely different for me. And what I read about from Leonard Cohen's book that I'm sure some of you have read was that Wabi-sabi maintains this idea of strident anti-rationalism. And maybe that was the thing. As I was kind of researching and exploring different objects and these tea ceremonies and these different artifacts that represented Wabi-sabi, the thing that I wanted to take away from it wasn't data or a framework or something I could apply in a top 10 checklist for my UX process, but actually something that it was much more soft. And it went back to this idea that I was introduced to very early in my days of David Carson, of thinking about how you could bring in intuition and a feeling into your design work that would just engage with people in a different way. That in some ways pushed this discussion around how you could design for emotion and how you could actually generate a feel. And that, in the end, was what Wabi-sabi represented for me. And I guess that's what I'm hoping for the future, given that we have Adobe in the house, and we have some very smart people from the academic world here as well, that in all of these beautiful new tools and services and the systemic design that we are creating, there's still space for the feel. There's still space for the intuition and the disruption and the provocation, the error or the flaw that makes you feel something different. And I think that's really the kind of takeaway from the Wabi-sabi example. Design that helps to drive emotion. So looking forward, and I'm assuming I'm running out of time, everything might change in the coming years for how we look at design processes. But if I think about my background as a designer and this continuous conflict and the frustration I felt with thinking about perfection versus imperfection, maybe nothing will change also as we move forward. And I hope that we will still keep battling for these imperfections and flaws as we move into our perfected future. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, wow. That was quite a dive deep. I'm kind of wordless. Does anyone in the audience have any quick comment or question that you'd like to pose, Andreas? Well, I'll make one question for you, so everyone gets something. My question is that regarding all this, I mean, you've mapped up so many different scenarios what might happen in the future. No one really knows. Are you personally more afraid or more excited about the future in the interaction design world and these tools that are developing?
Definitely, definitely excited. I think I should answer this in two parts. I think I'm excited when it comes to the context that I was speaking about, which is craft, how we create things and how we make things and the tools that we're using. I'm very excited about that because I feel like this, in a similar fashion to what Kasparov described, will unleash a new era of advanced design. But the second part of the answer is, of course, that with everything else that is happening in the world, I'm sure that these tools that I'm describing in many ways can be used for whatever reason possible. And they can be used for good or they can be used for something really negative or bad as well. And I think this is probably, and it's been a continuous theme here, something that every designer today is grappling with, understanding if we can still keep talking about craft as something that is separate and different from the rest of the world, or if nerds like me should just accept the fact that actually it's part of a bigger picture, and some of these technology changes and innovations that are coming will actually might be used to reinforce biases and some of the problems that we're facing in design today. So very positive with regards to craft and creativity and exploration, but a little bit concerned about the bigger picture, of course, like many others.
The society.
Yes.
Thank you, Andreas. You
Thank
can
you.
catch Andreas later on during the breaks. Thank you for coming.
You.